Hozir ma Facebook'a nasıl okunan baat sarmıkım dostum. Selamun aleyküm. I have some problem with my other computer. Okay. Everything okay. Окей. Привет всем, друзья. Сегодня у нас очень интересная тема. Сегодня у нас в эфире наш друг нашего IT-сообщества Шерсандинов, наш специальный гость из Америки, Rahul Pandey. В настоящее время работает инженером Android в Фейсбуке. Он работает на портале Facebook умной видеосвязи, разработанной специально для вашего дома, который очень в будущем один из лучших, надеюсь, станется, со встроенной функцией Alexa. Он также читает лекции в Стэнфордском университете, где преподает разработку Android на факультете компьютерных наук. Он также читает так. До того, как он присоединился к Фейсбуку, Rahul был инженером, основателем стартап-компании под названием Kosei, системы рекомендаций по коммерческому обучению в сфере машинного обучения, которая позже была куплена Pinterest, а затем он работал в Pinterest в течение 3 лет. Друзья, давайте начнем. Share, please.
Hello, Rahul. Welcome to our stream. We are very happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So today, Rahul will be talking about various topics related to Android, such as Android application architecture, REST API, GraphQL. But before we do that, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, well, so first of all, Eric, and thanks so much for having me. I can't claim to have understood all of the intro that Eric had done for me, but yeah, I mean, I heard some of the words, Pinterest, Facebook, portal, so I think we're talking about me. So yeah, I appreciate everyone who's joining to kind of spend some time with us. I'm Rahul. I live in Bay Area. I live in Redwood City, California. And my journey to where I am right now is I attended Stanford. I joined, maybe 11, 12 years ago is when I joined. I was there for 5 years. I got a bachelor's and master's degree in computer science. And then one interesting thing, I don't know if people here are familiar with Stanford.
Yes,
yeah, it's center of Silicon Valley, right? So I think I was swept up in this environment of being around startups and technology and programming. And that's what led me down this path of really kind of playing around with technology, kind of trying to dive deep and get good at something. And during my last year at Stanford, I was doing research with a professor. And the faculty, the professors at Stanford are world class. So I was really lucky to have the opportunity to work with them. And the work that we did in that lab turned into a startup. So I was a founding engineer at the startup, and I was doing recommendation systems and machine learning. And very quickly, that company got acquired. That was actually a very interesting experience. I can talk more about that if people are interested. But that was acquired by Pinterest. I was at Pinterest for a few years, and that's where I made the transition into Android development and Android programming.
Awesome.
So I was at Pinterest for a while, and then about 3 years ago, I moved over to Facebook, which is where I am working today. And I work on a product called Portal, which is like a video calling hardware device, which is based on Android. And I also, the other thing I really, really enjoy doing is teaching. So in addition to Facebook, I also have been spending a lot of time teaching seminars or workshops about Android, and also I publish some tutorials on YouTube.
Awesome. And the next question is, so as you said, you mentioned Android, and why did you choose Android to do Android development or iOS?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of reasons. I think a lot of it, honestly, is not so much of me having a deliberate decision to pick iOS or Android development over iOS or web. It really was based on the people around me. So when I was at Pinterest and I made the transition from a machine learning engineer into an Android engineer, I looked at the people around me and said, who can I learn the most from? And actually, a lot of the decisions I've made looking back at my time in Silicon Valley has been more based on the people rather than the technology. Like the way I look at it, the technology is a means to an end. And it doesn't really matter what you use as long as you're having impact at the end of the day. And oftentimes your impact is going to be more driven by the people around you rather than the technology choice you make. Like I think, Cher, you sent me some questions. Okay, like how do I think about architectures? And we can talk more about that in a little bit if people are interested. But honestly, my high level answer to that question is I don't really care about architecture. I care about the end product of what application we're building and what impact does it have for the user. So that's kind of the same thing with Android. I think there was like one really, really strong Android engineer at Pinterest who I learned a lot from, and that was really what led me down that path. That's kind of the kind of real answer. But beyond that, I think Android, as probably a lot of people here already know, is a huge platform, right? There are more than 2 billion devices which run Android. And I think in terms of being able to reach the most number of people in the world, Android is definitely, you're going to have a lot more success doing that with Android compared to iOS.
So Rahul, you already mentioned this, and based on your work history, you were a founding engineer at a venture-backed startup called Kosei, right?
Yeah.
A machine learning commerce recommendation system, which was later acquired by Pinterest. So I think our audience would be interested to learn more about this. So can you tell us a little more about your startup and why you chose to do a startup right after college?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this is actually
college,
the same thing, where it really was driven by the people around me. So when I was finishing up my time at Stanford, I had signed up. I was prepared to go to a big tech company in Silicon Valley. But then as I was approaching graduation, the professor who I was working with for the whole year, he reached out to me and said, hey, I'm thinking about taking a sabbatical from Stanford. Like I'm going to take 1 or 2 years off, and I'm going to pursue a startup. Are you interested? And for me, like my thought process was that, you know, the big company is always going to be the big company. It's always going to be there. And so the opportunity to work as a founding engineer with someone who I really respect and someone who I can learn a lot from, that opportunity may not always be there. So I made the decision to say, okay, let me put that big company tech job on hold and let me join the professor. And I tried that out for a year. And I have no regrets about doing that. It was an interesting experience, good and bad. But I mean, that was kind of the reasoning why I joined a startup instead of going to the big company. Yeah.
And so what are some things that help your startup succeed and get acquired by Pinterest eventually?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is actually that's a good question. I feel that the company got acquired after about 9 months, which is very, very early, right? I mean, if you look at most companies, either they'll survive as an independent company for a long time, or they'll get acquired after maybe 2, 3, 4 years. So 9 months in the market is actually a very short amount of time. And I think that was driven mostly by talent. Like if you looked at the professor who I worked with, was pretty well known in the industry. So I think when Pinterest was looking at the company, it was not so much about, oh, the product is really good, or they have a lot of customers. We didn't really have any customers. So I think it was largely driven by Pinterest knew that the team we had assembled at this company was really good. And no matter if we had a product or not, that was irrelevant. They were more worried about, they cared much more about the talent or the engineering rather than the product. So I think that was one thing, which, I mean, it's not, so like to call it a success is one way of framing it. But I don't think we had success in a traditional sense that, we had a product which affected millions of people. We didn't have a product. It was purely a talent acquisition.
Yeah, definitely. And so what are some lessons you learned from working for your startup?
Yeah, so I think what I mentioned earlier about it was a good and bad. It really was, there were some of the good parts were that, it was a very small team and I felt a lot of ownership, right? Like it was at the point where I was defining what did our interview process look like from start to end. And I actually managed a Twitter account for our company, right? So these are things that, I work at Facebook now.
Yeah.
There's no way Facebook would let me run the Twitter account or the Facebook page for Facebook, right? Like there's a huge team dedicated to that. So that's one of the things that's unique to a startup, where you have the ability to do a lot more breadth of things than you do in depth. Where my job right now is all about depth. I'm a specialist in one particular area, and that's good. That was fun. I think one of the things that also comes with the territory of a startup is that you don't really have that much mentorship. So like once I was in the startup, I was one of 3 engineers or one of 2 engineers when I initially started. And when you wanted to get help, I was working on some things around Hadoop and like data pipelining. And honestly, I didn't really know that much about it. I had to learn it on the job. And learning it in isolation, by Googling things, is much, much harder compared to if you can grab someone who sits a few feet away from you and says, hey, I want you to help me debug this problem, right? That's much faster, and you'll learn a lot more compared to if you have Google for everything or look on Stack Overflow for everything. So I think that was one thing I didn't really enjoy, that I felt very much like I was thrown into the deep end. I had to figure things out as I went through without too much guidance. Whereas at Facebook, I feel much more comfortable because I have more of an understanding of what's happening. I think I'm more senior now, so I kind of have a better understanding of what's happening in the code base. But in addition to that, there's also a whole team of really, really smart people that I can lean on to learn from them. And that's actually a really nice structure to grow your career.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very interesting differences between working at the big tech company and working at a small startup or a startup. So now let's go back to our main topic, and feel free to screen share if you want to show something. Like we said, can you please talk about Android application architecture in large companies? And then, as I said before, which Android architecture to go with as a startup? Right.
So in terms of Facebook, so Facebook is like the biggest of the big, right? It's like a huge company. It's almost like I don't even think of Facebook as one company. I think of it in some ways as like many small companies. You have Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, WhatsApp. I work on a product called Portal, which is fairly independent from the actual Facebook app. And so the architecture for each Android app that you talk about, there's probably 20 different Android apps that Facebook develops. The architecture will be different for each one. And I think if you're coming into a company like Facebook or Google or any of these big companies, it's actually not so much up to you to determine the architecture. It's really like you're coming into a very mature code base, which is oftentimes 3, 4, 5, 10 years old, right? There's a huge amount of history in that code base. So your job is more to maintain that same structure. Like the way I think of architecture is that if someone looks at your code and can't determine the architecture, like it's muddy, like, oh, one person writes in a particular style and then another engineer writes in a different style, that's a broken architecture, right? Architecture should be a way to paint the picture of how your features are developed. So I think that's kind of the tongue-in-cheek answer, which is that you don't think about architecture, you follow the existing pattern and you just apply that. If you're doing your own app, then of course you have a lot more leeway and latitude to pick how do you want to design and build your app. Yeah. And I'm not very prescriptive about this. I feel like my philosophy is that, there's no correct answer for architecture, right? Like the fact that you have a lot of really smart people in the Android community who are debating about what is better, MVP architecture or MVVM architecture or some other pattern. The fact that you have smart people debating that means that there is no clear, objectively right answer, right? It depends on the context, it depends on what you know. And I think more importantly than just like than arguing about a particular architecture, I think the more important thing is understanding the code you write, how does it fit into architecture, right? So every app, the way I think about it, is every app has 3 different components, right? One which is like the presentation layer, which is like how do you put things onto the UI, the pixels that you put on the screen. The next is the domain layer, which is your Kotlin code or your Java code, and how do you represent the data in your Kotlin or Java code. And then the third is the data layer, which is how do you actually get data for your application. And what that might be through a file or through a database or through talking to some API, right?
Yeah.
And so every line of code in your application, you can categorize in one of these buckets, either presentation layer, domain layer, or data layer. And as long as you, like what I would recommend, if you already have some existing apps out there, go through method by method in your Android app and categorize each method as one of those three: presentation, domain, or data layer. And if you're finding that the same file or the same module has a bunch of methods that are across all three layers, like you have one method which is for the data layer, and then right below that you have one method which is for the presentation layer, that's a sign of a broken architecture. So that's kind of like my high level thought. I don't really have, it really depends on like MVVM or MVP or whatever pattern you use. It depends on kind of what you know, but that's kind of how I think about assessing your architecture.
Awesome.
If that helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Our next question, what are some third-party libraries do you recommend it using?
Right, so this also, in the world of Java, I think there are a lot of libraries that, a lot more libraries that you use compared to Kotlin. And Kotlin, I've been recently, like in the past 6 months or so, getting more and more into Kotlin. And you have Kotlin extension functions in Android, which actually make Android programming a lot easier in Kotlin. And so a lot of the libraries I used to use in Java world, like Butterknife, which was like this annotation processor, I actually find I don't even need them in Kotlin, which is really nice. So I definitely would recommend, if folks haven't tried out Kotlin yet, I'm not sure where people are on the spectrum, but Kotlin it makes it a lot easier. And then other than that, I would say that, you know, there's such a huge and rich repository of libraries in Android that it really comes down to what are you familiar with. Like, for example, image loading, right? No one that I know re-implements image loading on Android. You always use Glide or Picasso or some image loading library that's already out there. Same thing with networking. Most people I know will either use Retrofit or Volley or, you know, async HTTP client, some library out there. So like, typically what I do is I go on GitHub, I look at how many stars it has, how many forks it has, and then if it does have a certain threshold number, then you can rely on this. You can depend that this is going to provide high quality functionality, given that, you know, it's being used in a bunch of other apps. And that's kind of how I pick which library to use.
Awesome. So recently, a lot of companies have been using GraphQL and as an alternative to REST. Can you talk a little about this too?
Mm-hmm. So GraphQL is used quite heavily at Facebook. I think it was invented at Facebook. Someone might actually know more about than I do. But yeah, GraphQL is used quite heavily at Facebook. And I think the main value of GraphQL is that when you have very data models and those that also change frequently, then GraphQL is really great about doing that, because the idea of GraphQL is you specify exactly what fields of the data that you want to pull out, right? And then you make a query, and then the server will try and fulfill that and populate only those fields, right? So if you have, I don't know, some complex data objects like a user object or a post object, like you're making a blog, you can imagine how that might change over time. And so you don't want to pass back all this extra data that may not be relevant to clients if it's not going to be used. And so the client specifies what fields it wants, and the server only fulfills those requests. I think so that's like the benefit of GraphQL. If you have a lot of changes that you expect in your data schema, GraphQL makes it really easy. However, I think one of the downsides of GraphQL are that caching, I actually don't know entirely the details, but the caching story with GraphQL is harder, right? With HTTP, if you have a RESTful API, for example, you're making a GET request on a particular resource, HTTP will by default already handle caching natively. Like it'll say, okay, you're making a GET request on this particular resource, and I know that this resource hasn't changed. So I can already provide you the result of that query because I know that resource hasn't changed. With GraphQL, it becomes a little more complicated. So that's like one thing to watch out for. And also, I think in general, GraphQL is a little bit harder it's a little bit more complicated. most of the time when you make a GraphQL request, you'll get back a 200 response, an okay response. And you'll get it back a 200 response, but the actual fields in that response might not be filled out, or you might have an error in some of those fields. Like you might get an error, but it still is a 200 response. And so there's a little bit more complexity with GraphQL. But if you are a startup, for example, and you're imagining that your data schema might change frequently, then I think GraphQL has a lot of value.
Awesome.
How to promote mobile application in Google Play?
So I only have a few apps on Google Play. So I definitely, I can't claim to be an expert in like how to get an app which has millions of downloads. I mean, I've never run an app which has that many downloads. I work in companies which are really successful in the Google Play Store, but I can share what I think works. And I actually have a really good friend who has published multiple apps, and each of his apps have millions of downloads. So I don't know if there's a chat feature on here, but later on maybe I can share a link. He wrote a very comprehensive article about how he succeeded in Google Play. So I'm basically going to talk about what he wrote, which I think is really good advice.
Awesome.
Yeah, but basically his advice is that, Google Play, a lot of it, if you're not going to spend marketing money on like promoting your app, which I imagine a lot of the people who are watching, you're not going to spend $100,000 to promote your app.
Yeah.
So then it becomes really critical to think about SEO, right? SEO stands for search engine optimization. If you're an indie developer, if you're a small time developer and you're working on a team of less than, 10 people, a small app, then the majority of the people who download your app are going to be finding your app through searching on Google Play. And so what your job is you need to figure out how can you be the top ranked app for those search terms that are relevant for you. And the way you do that is very, very simple. All you do is you have to understand what words are people searching for on Google Play, and then put those words in your application. It's that simple, right? Like let's say that you're building out, what's a good example? Let's say you're building, my friend who wrote this article, he built out a flashcard app. The idea is that if you're a student and you want to learn a language like Russian, right? Maybe some of you know Russian, right? It's a neighboring country. So if you want to learn Russian and you have a flashcard which has a Russian word on one side and English word on the other side, then you have to understand what are people actually what are the search terms that people who want that flashcard app searching for in Google Play. They probably will search for flashcard. They'll probably search for Russian, right? They'll probably search for things like that. And so then your job is put those words in the title of your app or in the very first few lines of your description. And you keep iterating on that process to see what is your target customer searching for on Google Play and put that in your app. And I think that's probably the best thing you can do beyond, of course, having a high quality application.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a very good advice. Thank you. So the next question is, can you talk about security of Android apps and what are some steps we should take as Android engineers to secure our app?
I think, again, I'm not sure if I'll give my perspective. One of the things about working at a big company like Facebook is that we have people who are much, much better at security than I am. So a lot of it is just I don't actually know it that well, but I can rely on these team of people who've been doing Android security for weeks or months or years who are much deeper at it than I am. So that's one of the things about a big company is that, you can delegate a lot of this work. But I think in general with Android security, there's a lot of things around reverse engineering your app. So you want to use tools like ProGuard, which will minify and obfuscate the variable names or method names of your application as kind of a best practice. You want to be careful about API keys. So anything that you use to be able to talk to your server or maybe a third-party API, you want to make sure that you're securing those keys so that they're not just living inside of your client code. And then there's also a lot of, when we look at, for every major feature that I work on, it goes through a security review, right? Security is taken very seriously. So one of the common things that we think about are how does your app interact with other apps on the user's phone? So could there be a malicious app which fires an implicit intent, for example, in the Android world, and your app responds to that implicit intent, and the data payload of that intent somehow does something malicious with your app? So you want to make sure that anything that you're exposing as functionality which other apps can interact with, you've locked that down as much as possible. So as much as possible, the malicious use of it is minimized. So those are kind of main things, like lockdown functionality, which is exposed to other applications. Make sure you're securing any API keys or credentials that you have, and kind of obfuscate or minify your code so it's harder for people to understand what's happening.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. What are your thoughts about Kotlin and Java?
I'm a big proponent of Kotlin. So like I've been recently, I think you mentioned this in the intro, I've, for about 8 or 9 months now, I've been really focused on teaching on YouTube and on other platforms, Android development, and I exclusively teach in Kotlin. I really feel that if you're already knowledgeable about Java, because that's what you have learned when you started out with Android programming, that's even better. Like you'll be able to transition to Kotlin even easier. But even if you've never done anything with Java or never done anything with Android before and you're brand new to Android, I really think that Kotlin is a much, much easier language to work with compared to Java. I think there's a couple things. One is that it's much more concise and readable, in my opinion. And the second thing is that a lot of the grunt work of doing, like, how do you do utility functions of like handling strings or maps or lists in Java, those are taken care of for you in Kotlin in like an inbuilt way. So rather than having a utility class in Java, which a lot of people might be familiar with, a lot of that is already built into the language. And then there's one more really big benefit, which is around nullability. Probably my favorite feature of Kotlin is that when you are developing an app, you have to, any issues with potential runtime null pointer exceptions are build time errors rather than runtime errors, right? I don't know if people are familiar with that, but yeah, basically, the sooner you can alert the developer of an issue at build time, that's always going to save time and money compared to letting that crash go and then having it crash at runtime. And so Kotlin's built-in nullability type checking system I think is really, really powerful.
Awesome. So now let's talk a little more about your role at Facebook. You mentioned you worked at a project called Portal. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, Portal is people are maybe familiar with the Google or like Amazon Alexa devices. So it's Google, those are basically smart home devices. The idea is that you have one in your home. It doesn't let you move around that much. It's not a mobile phone. It kind of stays in your living room and you can talk to it. So Facebook Portal is very, very similar in that it's a stationary device. It usually will live in your kitchen or your living room or some place in your home, and you can talk to it. The main value proposition of Portal compared to these other devices, though, is about connectivity. And Facebook, I mean, probably everyone knows, right? Facebook, the main service that Facebook is providing is the ability to connect with your friends and family. And so as a result of that mission, the main value proposition of Portal is being able to communicate either through a video call or a voice call with your friends and family. So every Portal comes with a screen, and you're able to use a voice command to say, hey, call my dad, call my brother, and it'll automatically call that person for you, and and you can kind of be in a hands-free video call with them.
So for that, do you mainly work with like Android OS?
Yeah, exactly. So the way our team is structured is we have a team of about, 15 or 20 people who work on the firmware, which is OS. So basically what we've done is we've taken Android Pie, we've taken a version of the Android operating system, which is open source. We forked it. We've made our own modifications to it. We've made some tweaks. And that is what's powering the Portal. And on top of our custom operating system, we have a bunch of maybe several dozen application engineers. I'm one of them. And we have our own custom-built Android applications on our custom hardware running this modified version of Android. That's kind of how the team is structured.
How did you go about like learning everything when you first started your job?
I think that was one of the challenges, and I think we're still working on it. I think if you talk to a lot of the people who are new on the team, they'll tell you joining Portal compared to joining another team at Facebook is actually much harder, because we have a very different environment on Portal. We have your own custom operating system. We have a different set of build tools. We have a much more kind of complicated ecosystem. I think the onboarding process in Portal is much harder than, if you're working on a traditional vanilla like Instagram app, which is, a single application. So I think the way to answer your question, how did I pick it up? Honestly, a lot of it is like trial and error. Like the way I learn is I take a project, I take an application or a project, and I break it. I purposefully break it. And then I try and understand how did it break. And oftentimes the process of figuring out how something broke and then repairing it, that is where, for me, a lot of learning happened. So that's kind of my general philosophy. And I did a lot of that. Like I would say for the first month or 2 months, most of my time was spent breaking something and then fixing it.
Awesome. That's very good advice for people. So the next question is, let's talk a little about like interviewing for Android roles at big tech companies. So how different it is to interview for Android position compared to a general software engineer position at big tech companies such as like Facebook and Pinterest?
I think it depends a lot on the kind of company you're looking at. Actually, I'm curious, maybe you can share with me, or do you have a sense for most of the people watching, are they interested in like the big company, the medium company, or the startup, like the very small company? Do you have a sense of that?
We have various people watching the stream. So there are people who are just learning about it. There are people who already work at some big tech companies. So it's like different audience with different background. So
okay. I mean, yeah, I think like at Facebook, Google, these kind of larger tech companies, I think the interview process is very standardized. So almost always you're going to have like 5 or 6 interviews in a single day. And if you're doing a general software engineering role, you're going to have the majority of those interviews will just be like general algorithm questions. So people have probably heard of leak code. So when I was preparing for my interview, I spent a lot of time doing leak code. I just prepared a lot of different, the general algorithm questions. So that's the general software engineering role. If you're looking at Android roles, the way Facebook works is that you would have the typical loop of 4 or 5 interviews, but you would have 1 or 2 dedicated Android interviews. The idea being that they would then ask you about, okay, what Android apps have you built, and what was the architecture of those apps, what libraries did you use? They want to kind of go deeper into Android with you. So that's kind of the only difference at Facebook or big companies. If you're interviewing for a role at a small company, I think it really depends on the small company. I think there's a lot of companies that I have friends who have started or who have joined, and they actually don't care at all about algorithms. They only care about how much Android knowledge do you have. And they'll look at your GitHub profile, or they'll look at kind of the apps you've published in the Play Store. And that'll be the primary way that they assess whether you will, get the job or not based on your experience. But they don't care. They care much less about the algorithmic part.
Okay. We know that you have been teaching Android and also have your own YouTube channel for people who are new Android. What are your steps for them to take to start a career as an Android engineer?
To get started as an Android engineer, I would say that it kind of depends on your on where you are. So I think for someone like me, I went to a school that was in the middle of Silicon Valley, right? So we had literally dozens of companies that came in and wanted to recruit students from my school. And so for someone like that, if you're at a technical school and you have companies that are recruiting, then I think the easiest way to get your foot in the door and to start doing Android roles is to go to the career fair or whatever is a meeting place where you can interact with industry partners and give your resume to them and get a job. And even if you don't get a job initially as an Android engineer, I think if you work at a big enough company like Facebook, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll join Facebook as a general engineer. And then a year later or 2 years later, they'll transition from a general engineer to an Android engineer. That's like my general advice. If you don't have that framework or that structure in place where you have a career fair, then I think it's a little bit harder, but it's definitely doable. What I'd recommend then is you should build out a portfolio of apps. So like I've been teaching Android at Stanford, and I do it on YouTube as well. And everything I do, most of the videos I have are basically helping you to build an app. So I would just do that. I would say like build 10 apps, maybe publish 1 or 2 of them in the Play Store. And that way you can show them off to people. When you go into an interview or when you send an email to the hiring manager, you can tell them, hey, I've a student or I've been working in this other company, but I've been doing Android on the side, and I can prove it to you because I have these 2 or 3 or 4 apps that you can download right now and you can play with. And I think if you have, a good number of installs, or if you have a really high quality app, I would be surprised if you didn't get an Android job if you, are really consistent about that.
Awesome.
For people who want to start their own startup, what steps should they take to be successful?
One quick question. I'm curious. Are most of the people here are they in Tajikistan, or are some people are in Silicon Valley or in the US? Or I'm just curious, geographically, where are people?
Yeah, mainly in Tajikistan, and also it's being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook, which means there are people who also like studying in the US currently.
Got it. Okay.
So, yeah, mainly Tajik people all around the world.
Got it. Okay. Wow, that's amazing. You have a global audience. So I think, I don't honestly know too much about, but basically my advice is that you want to get connected with the people who can help you. And I think the magic of living in California, Silicon Valley, is that it's not that hard to find people who can help you. Like either reach out to engineers who have startup experience. Like I'm happy to help if people want to reach out to me, whatever I can offer. But I mean, there are many other people out there in the world who can help, right? So if you're in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of venture capitalists who are just out there. And so talk to them about like what they see as gaps in the market. Talk to your potential customers and ask them what do they need. So if you're in Silicon Valley, that's actually a really easy way to kind of reach out to people. If you're not in Silicon Valley, I think that you have to be a bit more inventive, but it really comes down to the product, right? So start building a product, get it in front of people who actually would be using it, and get their feedback. And basically that's kind of the general pattern, right? Is if you want a successful startup, you have to build something that people want. The way you figure out if you've built something that people want is by getting feedback from people. And so it's very different from the job interview process, right? Like if you want to get a job at an Android company or any company, then you build an app which is technically interesting, and then I think you'll get a job. The question here is, if you want to build a successful startup, you have to not only build something which is interesting, but you have to build something which people actually want, and that's actually much harder. So I think that would be my main thing, is like build something that people want, get feedback from people, and then if you're in a place like Silicon Valley, or I don't know, maybe in Tajikistan, you have a community of people who are doing startups, and interact with them, because I think a lot of the value is interacting with people and getting mentorship or getting help from people around you.
Awesome, definitely. And Rahul, you do a lot of teaching besides work, like teaching at CodePath and also Stanford. So what are some benefits of teaching in addition to working full-time at the Silicon Valley?
Honestly, teaching is something I would recommend for every single person here. Even if you don't feel like you may not know enough to teach, or you don't have enough experience, the act of teaching forces you to figure out how to communicate. And I think this is actually very relevant to the startup and getting a job. So no matter what you do, whether you're going to get a normal job as an engineer somewhere, you're going to create your own company, and you're going to build a startup, the art of communication and taking an idea in your head and then expressing that clearly so that people can understand what you're saying. And not only that, but also building a vision, like saying, okay, here's what I'm communicating, here's what I'm going to talk about next week or next month or next year, right? Like building a vision of what you're going to say. That is critical for anything, no matter what you do. And I think the best way to get better at that is by teaching. So that's really what compelled me to teach, is that, it forces you to communicate, and that's a very important life skill. And then of course, the more obvious thing, which is really, really gratifying, is that it feels good, right? Like when you're teaching, and I teach at Stanford, and you get that feedback from students, wow, I understand what you're saying. I built, like, for example, one of my students in the class published their app to the Play Store. Mm-hmm. So like that was like a very gratifying feeling of, I was able to download her app. I gave it a 5-star review. I was able to share it with my parents and my family. They downloaded her app. Like that feeling of being able to help someone and show them something really powerful, I think that's very gratifying.
Awesome. And also, you went to Stanford for your undergrad and master's degree. And can you talk about how important was it for you to go to college? And what do you think in general, should we go to college to get computer science knowledge? And this goes back to kind of the same thing that we were talking about earlier,
which is that follow the people. And like what I've been doing for my whole time working as an engineer is I followed the people who I think are really smart and just kind of blindly do what they do, right? And I think that the same theory is applicable to college, right? I went to my high school was okay. I went to high school in Michigan, like in the middle of the country, and it was fine. But I think the reason I was excited about going to Stanford is that I actually didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone in California, or at least no one in the Bay Area. But I knew that Stanford had really smart people, and that my ability to interact with them and my ability to kind of learn from them would obviously be a lot higher if I went to a college like Stanford compared to if I tried to build apps on my own. So like in general, I think my answer is college is really valuable because it gives you a space and the opportunity to interact with like-minded people who are also learning. If you have that, if you have a community of people who you really are feeling, who you feel like you can learn from and thrive in that environment, wherever you live right now, in high school, or if you're not in college right now, wherever you live, then that's great. Maybe you don't have to go to college. But for someone like me, I really, really valued my 5 years at Stanford because I was able to learn from these really amazing people from all around the country at Stanford.
Awesome.
To keep up to date with Android news, what are some websites, podcasts do you recommend that we should check out?
I mean, this is actually a good question because I feel like I honestly don't do that good a job of it. Okay, to answer the question, I subscribe to the Android developers YouTube channel. So every time they come out with a video, I always try and keep up with what they're talking about. They usually have educational content around like Kotlin features or new architectures or new libraries in the world of Android. So that's helpful. Also, there's a few weekly email digests that I subscribe to as well. They will basically give me a rundown of like what is the hot topic in Android for that week. That's kind of what I do to stay up to date. But I think to also the other answer to that question is I feel like it's honestly not that important. The world of Android is changing so rapidly, right? I mean, people who have done Android for any meaningful amount of time will know that every single month, every single year, there's a brand new library, framework, or even a brand new language, right? Like Kotlin is a brand new language that all of us have had to learn. And so my general advice is that don't worry so much about the hot new thing. I would worry much more about building out apps using the knowledge you already have. And when you find out that, okay, I'm doing this thing which I think is kind of annoying or repetitive, or I'm not doing it in the proper way, that's the point at which you can Google for, is there a better way to do this? And then if you find out a library which fits your problem, like solves your problem, then you can learn more about that library. But I don't think it's a productive use of time to, spend 5 hours every week to learn whatever new has come out in Android. And it's very possible, right? You could definitely easily spend 10 hours a week just learning about or reading about the hot new topic in Android. But I don't think that, that's the best use of time.
And based on our conversation, you're very busy. You do full-time, you do teachings, and also YouTube channel. And how do you balance everything and still stay productive?
Yeah, I think I take it to kind of an extreme level. There's something called a productivity treadmill, where like every single day, I start my day by having a to-do list of here are the maybe 4 or 5 things that I need to get done. And I almost always like I call it the productivity treadmill because I always have to get it done. If I don't get it done, I feel like I'm going to fall off the treadmill, and it's like, for me personally, it's like very frustrating. So I make it a point to always, stick to that schedule. I think what really helps is, for me, the idea of consistency. So, like for example, with I make these videos on YouTube, right? What I commit to doing is no matter how small, I always commit to making one change, either a code change or I record a video for YouTube. I always do something every single day. And that's actually a really helpful mechanism in general, is that if you convince yourself to do one small thing, you'll often find that that's all you need to have more motivation to do the next thing. And you can kind of get on a pattern of continuing to build something and go deeper every day. So that's kind of the main thing I employ, is that like I always commit to doing at least one thing for my YouTube channel for teaching every single day. And that's one way to kind of make sure you're not plateauing anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. And we talked a lot, about a lot of things. And one thing we haven't talked about is your job at Pinterest, like what projects you worked on at Pinterest. Can you share a little information about that?
Yeah, so I was at Pinterest for about 2.5 years. The primary project that I worked on was a product called shopping or buyable pins. And the idea of that is, you know, I'm not sure if people are familiar with Pinterest, but Pinterest is this application where you can pin different items or ideas that are relevant for you. So for example, if I'm redecorating my home, I might pin some, you know, different furniture that I would want in my home. And the idea is that, you know, there's so much aspiration that happens on Pinterest. Like, what do I imagine my life to be? Wouldn't it be cool if we allowed people to act on that aspiration? And so not only do you pin the, you know, furniture that you want, we want to allow you to buy that furniture. And that's kind of what I worked on. It was really an interesting project because we talk about the kind of discovery funnel, right? Facebook is kind of about like high level discovery, like, oh, maybe you can target people who are interested in homes and you can show them ads. And then Google is much more lower in the funnel, where Google is like, you have an intent to say, I want furniture, and you can show ads relevant to furniture. And then Amazon is like very low in the funnel, which is like, I want to buy furniture. I'm going to go to Amazon and search for that exact furniture that I want, and I'm going to click the buy button. And so I think Pinterest was what we were trying to do is go from higher up on that funnel and go much lower. And the lower you go in that funnel, the more valuable. And so that was the project I worked on. And I think it was really interesting to learn, like, what are the challenges from going top of funnel to bottom of funnel? Because the mentality of how consumers think as they go from discovery to intent to purchase is very interesting and actually very challenging to really capture all of that in one application. But that was what I worked on for the Android app of Pinterest.
Definitely. And you also mentioned that you did some machine learning at your startup. And for people who are interested in machine learning, would you recommend they should learn first?
Machine learning is hugely powerful. And I think if you ask anyone in the next 5, 10, 20 years, machine learning is actually going to power more and more of our lives. Like it'll get to the point where you won't even realize that machine learning is doing something for you, but it is in the background. So I think machine learning is extremely powerful that way. But so basically, yeah, at the startup, basically what we were doing is we were doing recommendations for e-commerce. And the idea was that you often get recommendations of like, this product is similar to this product. And they're similar products. Like, for example, this couch is similar to this other couch. But how about this idea of modeling relationships between products as complements, right? So if you buy a sofa, you might also want to buy an end table. And so instead of only recommending other sofas to you, can we also recommend end tables and be smart about that recommendation? That was kind of the work that I was doing, trying to understand how do these products relate to one another. I think one thing I'll mention is that, you know, you asked the question, like, should people learn machine learning or Android or something else? I think it really comes down to, what do you think you'll enjoy more? And so if I look back at my time at that startup and even before that, I really didn't enjoy the work that much. I think the idea is cool and the people I worked with were amazing, and that was really helpful. But if I look back at the actual pipelining and the Hadoop jobs that I was running at that time, I really didn't enjoy it. And that was why when I joined Pinterest, I made an active decision to leave I didn't want to do machine learning, and I wanted to do more around Android. And so I don't know if there is a really correct answer. It really depends on who are the people around you who can teach you and what do you enjoy doing.
Awesome.
Our final question from me and Cher. What is the future of Android?
Wow, that's a very deep question. I feel like I'm bullish on Android. I feel there's a very bright future for Android. And basically, like, let me tell you the two arguments, right? On one hand, you have the people who are much more in the cross-platform domain, which is like React Native or Flutter. And the idea is that, you know, it's kind of a waste of resources. If I'm a startup, I need to hire one Android engineer and one iOS engineer. Why do that when I could build out like basically a web app or like a React Native app or maybe a Flutter app and use that to create both an iOS and Android app? And I think if you're for a startup, actually it makes a lot of sense. Like you might want to do that because you might not have the time or resources or the money to hire an Android and iOS engineer. However, I really do think that Android's not going anywhere. Native Android development, as soon as you get to the point where you're large enough where you can afford to hire multiple people, like an Android person and an iOS person, I think it's very hard to compete with the performance and the feel of a native Android app. That you can build out a React Native app, but there's always going to be some gap between building at the cross-platform layer and building a native app, right? Because Google, when they're designing how to build out the brand new Android app, they don't really care about React Native. They want to build out they want to create libraries and APIs that are going to benefit native Android developers like us. And what that means is that React Native or Flutter is always going to play catch up, and they're always going to be kind of secondary citizens. And so if you look at the best Android apps out there, they're going to be written in native Android. And given how Android is the platform on which NBU is built, NBU stands for Next Billion Users, right? So that basically means in the next 2, 3, 5 years, hundreds of millions, maybe a billion people are going to be coming online. And the way they're going to be coming online is through an Android device. They're not going to afford an iPhone. And so given how much Android is increasing in terms of number of devices sold, and also given how important Android is in terms of like the quality and performance that you get with the native Android app, I don't think Android is going anywhere. In fact, I think it will grow in popularity in the coming years.
Awesome. Thanks, Rahul. And we have some questions from the audience right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
cool. Could you recommend some crash course about recommending algorithms that could be more practical for software engineers? Yeah, I think so. If we're talking about algorithms from the perspective of getting a job, like for example at Facebook or most of these big tech companies, they're going to ask you very kind of general algorithm questions. And I think for that, I would recommend, there's a book called Cracking the Coding Interview. That's what I used. So I literally read Cracking the Coding Interview cover to cover. I read everything. And that gives you a really good sense of, you know, what like big O notation and how can you apply different concepts like binary trees or maps into different algorithm problems. Aside from that, I would recommend LeetCode as like a way to really practice that. Once you exit that world, that's basically like, if you're talking about how do you get a job, what is the algorithms you need to know in order to get a job as an engineer? I think beyond that, there's also a whole world of algorithms which aren't really talked about that frequently in job interviews. And so if you're interested in that, I think there's a lot more to the world of algorithms. I would just recommend getting a book. Like at Stanford, I took a really, really interesting class about, you know, really hard algorithmic problems like P versus NP and how do you do approximations of these non-polynomial time algorithms. You can learn a lot more about that. Kind of depends on like what you're looking for. And then for the second question about do you recommend TensorFlow, I actually haven't used TensorFlow that much, but basically TensorFlow is a platform on which you can do a lot of machine learning, right? So I don't really know if it's, certainly there's a lot of algorithms that power TensorFlow, and it might be helpful to learn about how those work, but I don't think you necessarily will learn that much about algorithms from using TensorFlow. So I would kind of just be clear about what are you trying to learn, and make sure that if you're using TensorFlow, TensorFlow might abstract away a lot of the complexity for you. So if your objective is to learn that complexity, then don't use a platform like TensorFlow because you're going to be using the API, but you won't actually be understanding what's happening behind the magic curtain, if that makes sense.
Thank you for additional your answers. In our stream, people will then see because we have some technical problem in our Facebook. I think that more people will see them.
Yeah, a lot of times, you know, it's also a time difference there, and people will usually, our audience gonna watch it later as well, which is nice. And the video would be recorded. And cool. So any final words for people who want to start career as an Android engineer?
I think I'll repeat what I have been saying a few times now, which is for me, what has guided my path to what I'm doing today is really the people around me. And so if you're intent on being an Android engineer, I would find the people around you who are already building Android apps and ask, okay, can I sit with you? Can I work with you on a project, right? You're going to learn a lot more by like finding inspiration from people rather than trying to do everything in isolation. So that's kind of my general advice. No matter what you're trying to do, if you can find people around you who you can learn from, and maybe you can even teach them what you know, then I think that's probably the best way to get better and to find success.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rahul. You talk a lot about a lot of useful things, so we do really appreciate this, and thank you for showing up.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah. Thank you a lot, Rahul.
Yeah, thanks.
I think this is finished our stream. Thank you for your time. Thank you for additional recommendation, information. More, I think, is very developed our youth in Tajikistan, if on the world. Thank you for teaching. Thank you for your big channel about Android tutorial. I think it's very helpful for all developers.
And thank you. Rahul has a YouTube channel, by the way, for the audience who's watching this. Please follow his YouTube channel and subscribe to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I love teaching. I love to help out as much as possible. So if you, I mean, YouTube is definitely like one way to reach me. But however, email or Twitter or YouTube, whatever is the best way. If you all have, any additional questions or thoughts, I'd love to provide whatever guidance I'm able to.
Definitely. And we're also the video is recorded, so we're also gonna put some Russian subtitles at the bottom of the video for people who don't know English, so it reaches more people in Tajikistan and then develop the IT. Thank you very much, Rahul, for your contribution to this. Thanks so much, and we'll see you later.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone. Have a good night, wherever you are.
Good luck.
Thanks. Bye.